Hey everyone, Wilkinson here. My next two episodes are with Mel England. He's an actor. He moved to Palm Springs recently, and these are really good. You're going to enjoy them. Let me know what you think. Post some comments. Greetings, Wilkinson here. Today I am with Mel England. I've been looking forward to this. Say hi to my people, Mel.
Hi, how's it going?
It's going well, even weller since you're here.
Thank you.
I really have been looking forward to this.
Great to be here.
So we chatted a little before, and wow, what a life. I don't know where we're going to start. Tell a little about yourself. Just do some background stuff.
Wow. Well, as you know, I'm an actor, and I've also worked as a filmmaker. I've directed and I've produced, and but mainly I'm an actor, and sort of have a life as a openly pause actor, which is something that happened in my life about, I can't even remember. What year was that? 2009. So there's a whole story around that. But really, I grew up in the theater and in Texas, of all places. And then I went to New York and worked a lot in stage. And then I came out to Hollywood and did a few films and stuff. So I've been very lucky.
Did you grow up in Texas?
I did. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, which, people have lots of ideas of what Dallas is because of the old TV show.
Right.
And in some ways, there's some of that is still kind of somewhat the way, it is, but it's actually changed a lot. But I grew up at a time, my parents were hippies. And so I grew up with hippie parents. People always are surprised that there were hippies in Texas.
I was just going to say that.
But Dallas was a rock and roll town. And people also don't know that, but it was, like there's that song, Dallas, Texas, Hollywood, so there's a reason I think that's there. It was a party rock and roll town. And so there were a lot of hippies, and so I grew up with these very hippie parents, and my adopted mother had gotten a job at I guess in high school or something at the Dallas Theater Center, working in the costume shop, and she knew they had classes for kids. And so when I was, I think, 4 or 5 years old, I started taking my first acting classes. I just sort of took to it right away. And within a few years, I was in my first professional play there at the theater center. And
did she see something in you, or is that her interest and you're the kid, so you're going to go do it?
I think she just identified that I was really outgoing, crazy, lots of energy kid. And I think she just knew it was a thing that would be really good for me. And she was right, because I just loved it right away. And I just sort of knew I'd found my home. And the Dallas Theater Center really was kind of an amazing place to grow up. They're no longer mainly based in this building now, but there was a original theater there, was built in the 50s by Frank Lloyd Wright.
Oh, wow.
And so...
Is that still standing, that
building? It
building?
Is still there.
Oh, good,
and
good.
Oddly enough, you'd think that Dallas would actually, it would be more well known. But there's this really important Frank Lloyd Wright. And it's, sort of kind of like the Guggenheim. It's a similar shape. It's like these, it's got this big circles and like a triangle coming out of it that makes the audience. And if you could visualize, and it's on the side of a hill, and so it's this beautiful structure. And if you're ever in Dallas, what you have to do is you have to go there and find out if you can get a tour, and you have to do the tour of the whole thing, because it's just the way it goes from downstairs is this where the shop was, where they would, and then there were these ramps that would come up this sort of these cylinders to get the stage up to the circular stage, and then the audience. It's just beautiful design.
Is it being used, or is it vacant?
Yeah, actually, the Dallas Theater Center still uses it sometimes. They built a big sort of more modern theater in downtown Dallas in the Arts District, and so they still do use the Frank Lloyd Wright. I know a couple of years ago, they did a production with Betty Buckley and I think it was Tova Feldish, that they went back to the Frank Lloyd Wright. And then actually, because it's in the Oak Lawn area, which is the neighborhood there's an LGBTQ company that also, I think they're called Uptown Players. They sort of live there as well. So
Oh, cool.
it's still definitely in use.
I'm shocked though that I've never heard of that.
Everybody look it up because it's a real thing and it's a beautiful, I grew up, and the most unique thing about it, I think it explains a lot about my personality actually. Growing up in this Frank Lloyd Wright, there were no right angles in the entire building. So like the walls all had,
Going
an
every which
angle
way,
or a
yeah.
curve, or
Right.
so it was such an interesting. It feels like a very organic piece. Sadly, when the building was being built, evidently the funding that they were trying to get wasn't quite to scale, so they actually had to size it down. So in some ways, some of the limitations of the theater ended up being not only the audience size, but some of the things that they wanted to be able to do. It ended up being scaled down to size. So
Right.
it should have been actually bigger. So there was that, but it's really just a gorgeous place and a wonderful place to see a play. Actually, I love that theater. It's my home,
Cool.
by all means. Yeah.
Well, you've educated us.
Yeah.
All right. So back to your story. So do you have siblings?
I had mentioned I have an adopted mother. So I have my birth mother who, separated from my dad when I was a baby. And she had I had an older half brother with her. And then my father, after I left for college, remarried. And so I have a younger half sister. I really was raised like an only child. I didn't,
Right.
my older half brother, I did know, and I would see him but it's more like being a cousin or something.
Right.
So anyway, but I love them and I know them. I mean, my younger sister is still alive and we're very close, but it's, not the same as like, I have friends that have sibling rivalries
Right.
and,
You
all
didn't
that.
grow up together. Yeah.
No. I was already, I think I was 20 something when she was born.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you are gay.
Openly,
Yeah.
very, very gay.
So where does that fit into leaving Dallas?
Actually, that's a really good question. In my head, I grew up at the Dallas Theater Center, and then I went to a performing arts high school there, which a lot of the teachers had actually come to the theater center too. So I was really sort of crafted and shaped by this incredible artistic community in Dallas. Dallas, people don't know that either. It has this really big, thriving arts community, not just theater. It's like symphonies and operas, and because there's so much money there, and they really support the arts. So I was very lucky that way. But it was so conservative in the 80s, and I didn't, you can see things when you're older and you look back, but I think really in many ways I was escaping. I was escape Texas and I flee to New York because, on paper and in my brain, I thought I was leaving to go to NYU, and I was. But in some ways, when I landed in New York City, I was like, oh my God, I could finally breathe, because I'd always been living in this society and culture where you weren't allowed to be yourself.
Wow.
I don't probably have to explain that to you and many of your listeners, but there was a time when it's wild, because I go back to Dallas now and it's like progressive, which is great. I mean, there actually was a gay community there when I was in high school, and the first couple of years in college, I'd come back in the summers and do plays. And so, the gay community was very big, and I actually, as a teenager, one of my first jobs was delivering the gay newspaper around the neighborhood. It was called Oaklawn Today. And I didn't even, my adopted mother had started that job sort of as a side thing to make cash. And then my dad and I took over, which is also a weird story
So
too.
she was delivering those papers?
Yeah, it was like a weekly periodical,
Okay.
but instead of it being in newsstands or something, it would be laid out in businesses. And so she couldn't do it at some point. So my father and I took over, because they had split up at this point. So my dad and I took over doing this side job. And little job, but once a week, my dad would drive me around. This before I even necessarily knew I was gay, but I was certainly looking at the pictures, and I was looking at the guys when I go in the shop. I was figuring it out, but I was I don't even know how old, 10, 11, 12, preteen, I would say. But but it's funny because that newspaper did not it's no longer around. But when I think back, because I would sometimes read it, and it's really had me thinking about how important that newspaper was for the community, because that community was there. That's where you got all the information about what was going on in different cities and towns. And we didn't have the internet, remember?
Right.
And you certainly weren't getting the news about what was happening for gay people anywhere else.
Right.
So it was really, so funny. I'm on the board of the Lavender Effect, which is this gay history, LGBTQ history organization. And it's something we're exploring at some point, like sort of doing some kind of project around the history.
Where is that based?
Well, they're actually in LA.
The Lavender thing?
Okay. Lavender Effect, yeah.
Okay.
Lavendereffect.org. Andy, the founder, does amazing work, but it's sort of one of the things we're talking about is the idea of some kind of project around the story around gay periodicals and magazines. And because for a long time, before the internet, before social media, but even, while the Advocate might have been a public publication that was around the nation,
right.
Like in different towns and cities, you would have one little newspaper that was your source for finding out. And in the early days of AIDS and stuff like that, I'm sure that was really important. So anyway, I had that job, which was just sort of wild.
Well, how old were you when you went to New York City?
I was 18.
So when you're 18, did you know you were gay at that point?
Oh yeah. I mean, but somewhere, I think I sort of figured it out, around 13-ish. Yeah, I sort of knew. I certainly wasn't in the closet with my friends in high school. I also went to a performing arts high school. So, but...
Did you have a boyfriend in high school?
No, nobody. It was a weird thing where there were other gay people, but we were all, I should rephrase that. I kind of wasn't. Everybody was sort of
in the closet together.
Kind of in the closet, but we all kind of knew. But, it was that don't ask, don't tell world that we all lived in back then.
Right.
So, I had one friend, David, who took me to the gay bar for the first time when I was about 16. I've talked about this openly. I've been, I was even on Oprah talking, literally, I'm a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. So that's part of my story. And so what happened sexually for me was, I had sort of already had experiences. And at a certain point, going to gay bars and, having that was certainly, nothing was surprising, I should say. The sexual abuse, that whole story, that's a whole other aspect of this, but I'll just say, I was very comfortable in a way. And I'd grown up in the theater and I just, so I sort of found my tribe there. But it wasn't until I got to New York that I was like, oh my God, thank God. Because it just suddenly wasn't the same issue as it was back in Texas back in the day, where we did live in a don't ask, don't tell world. I just recently went back to Dallas for my father passed away from Alzheimer's about 8 months ago. And so over the summer, we had a memorial. And I was very, very happy. Sad about my dad, of course, but a weird kind of homecoming for me in a way with my dad's family, because I'm going to get emotional. I brought my husband, Tony, and they had never met him. And
do they know he existed?
Some of them did.
Okay.
But they were so accepting and loving and wonderful. But some of it was just stuff that I had in my head about, I wasn't accepted. But it's also because there was just this thing that we all lived in way back when.
Right.
And it's not like I had ever come out to them, because that was kind of before the time you even came out to people. It wasn't even, so there was sort of this unknown, unsaid world that I was going back. And I was like, well, Tony's coming with me. And, a lot of them I had already known or had met, a couple of them had met Tony before, but I was just it just felt so good to be able to come back to Dallas and have my husband and bury my father. And it was really, really beautiful to be accepted in a way that I did not expect. I could tell there were some people that, are it's still kind of uncomfortable for them because it's foreign in many ways. I think for a lot of us that are older, none of this is weird, but for younger people, they might not relate. There was just a time when, you did do Don't Ask, Don't Tell, not because you were ashamed or afraid, but just because that was just the only option. Like, you didn't, that's just the way the world was.
Right.
So in some ways, by being out, that created, a dynamic that makes people uncomfortable, because prior to that, we'd all hidden behind this pretend world of,
right,
we're not talking about it.
Did you come out to your folks at some point? Or?
Yeah, all three of my parents knew. I had a very difficult relationship coming out with my father, partly because it also got wrapped up in HIV, because, I've been out openly positive. But I seroconverted after a couple of years in New York. And it was very early on. I was 19 or 20. I can't remember exactly at this moment. I'm thinking 19, and I was going to turn 20. But needless to say, it was, just a really difficult time. And I had taken a leave of absence from school. I sort of had this, basically, we call it a nervous breakdown. And I was, I think, really afraid that I had HIV. And I think that's really what was going on. And
so you were afraid before you found out that you were positive?
Yeah, okay. Because I had, oddly enough, it's one of those stories where even though I did certainly do my share of getting around town, I was so hypervigilant and so scared. So I was very safe. And this was, a long time. I mean, this is in the late 80s, and a lot of people knew about HIV, but at the same time, what I was discovering as a young person in a world with people that had a lot more experience and older people is there was still kind of a casualness sometimes about condoms and that kind of stuff. And so I was just trying to be very safe. But yeah, I think I had a boyfriend for a period of time one summer back from New York, and we did not have safe sex. And that was, I think, and actually, usually, I mean, if I'm going to be frank, well, I'll just put it in a polite way for
yes, please,
whoever. But I'll just say that normally I would not have been in a football term, the wide receiver.
Okay.
Normally I was throwing the football, but this particular time, there was one time, and I think that one time was it.
Wow.
So that's all it took. But it happened. And when I for I had this nervous breakdown, and I had to take time off of school, and then I was going to go back to school, and they wanted a letter for me to come back to school that said, from the psychiatrist or the doctor, that said, Mel's okay. So, I have to go to a psychiatrist. So I go to the psychiatrist and I start talking to him. And you're just talking about whatever, my mother, my father, things you talk about with a shrink.
And this was the first time with this person?
Yeah. I went to a few sessions. I can't remember how many times. Okay. But then at some point he said, well, what? I said, I'm just so afraid. And he said, well, what are you afraid of? And I said, AIDS. And he said, oh, well, then why don't you get a test? And I said, oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So I went to go get an HIV test. And it was like a day before I was going back to New York, literally. And the doctor called, the shrink called. And over the phone, he told me that I was HIV positive.
So the results went to the shrink?
Yeah, because I guess he's the doctor who ordered the test.
Okay.
That's how, it's not like I went to a clinic that's how it worked. So he called me and he told me that. And I said, oh, okay. And I said, thank you very much. And I hung up the phone. And I thought, if I tell my parents, they won't let me go back to New York. And so I didn't tell them. So for a couple of years, they didn't know. I sort of left New York. I had to leave. I left within a year. I had left NYU because I thought I'll never be an actor. I was on full scholarship. I had, studying with Marlon Brando's acting teacher, and I thought I'll never be an actor.
Because you were not going to make it. That's what you're thinking.
Yeah, because, I'm going to die. But plus,
right.
They gave me 6 months to live. And
wow.
That was what people were saying back then, right? So I just thought, okay. And I had a friend who was living in Colorado at the time who didn't go to university. She just went to Colorado to live in the mountains and work at a health food store and, collect crystals and things like that. And so she called me up. I called her, and I was living in my dorm on Union Square on the 6th floor thinking about jumping out of my window every day. And she said, come out here. People are healing themselves of all sorts of things. And so it was the only hope I heard. And I just thought, I'll never be an actor. And I quit. I left. And, the only role model I'd had was like, Rock Hudson, and he was dead. So I left and I moved to the mountains in Colorado, and I pursued alternative medicine, which didn't really work out, really. But I avoided the AZT for like 10 years while they didn't know what they were doing. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you weren't on anything for 10 years?
Basically. Well, not 10. If I do the math.
Well, a long time, basically.
Well, it was about 8 years. About 8 years
okay.
before I got sick and I almost died of AIDS in 97. Anyway, somewhere along there, to get back to your original question, somewhere along there, I came out to my dad and I told him that I was HIV positive, and it did not go very well.
Were you in Colorado at that time?
I was sort of leaving. I was in what I call my geographic period. I was, sort of bouncing between, I'd gone to New Mexico to work with a homeopath who was, would take droplets of my blood and do this like, kind of, what do you call those things that swing back and forth?
Like a pendulum?
Yeah, pendulum. It was going to read, and I was trying to be a homeopathic, macrobiotic vegetarian, and any given day I was going to quit smoking and eating red meat and sugar and flour and caffeine. And, I'd wake up and I'd drink a cup of coffee and I'd think I'm killing myself. And so I'd smoke a joint to calm down. And that night I was in the bar. So it was always tomorrow.
Right.
And, so this was sort of a period where Colorado, I had decided to come back to New York, but I hadn't really I just couldn't figure it out. So I was bouncing around. I went back to Texas. And at the time, Amendment 2 was going on. And I don't know if remember that battle in the LGBTQ history.
That's in Texas?
That was in Colorado.
Or in Colorado, okay.
Yeah, and it's sort of we got... Proposition 8, Prop 8 was a thing in California, but
right.
Amendment 2 was Colorado in the early 90s, and I think it was 92. And they were trying to outlaw, like cities like Denver and Boulder and Vail and Aspen, like the liberal towns had made these laws that you could not discriminate against people for employment or for housing if they were based on sexual orientation.
Right.
And the state people came along, and conservatives in the states, and decided to try to outlaw it at the state level. And so there was it was a referendum on the ballot. And so and it ended up passing, and then later it got overthrown in court. But at the time the battle had been raging. And so when I went back home, I was sort of having kind of a political debate with my father. And he said things that, I think ultimately my dad was just not wanting me to be gay. And he couldn't really accept it. And so in that sort of heated debate, I ended up coming out as having AIDS. And
did he know you were gay though at that point?
Well, that's what we were. He was. That was the discussion. That's what we were debating. Right. He was trying to tell me that I could be cured by a psychiatrist. Like he kind of thought of it, and many people thought it was a mental disorder. That was the whole thing with AMA way back when. And so, my journey with my father ended up being, because I took care of him, and, he had Alzheimer's, and it's been a beautiful love story of forgiveness and, me needing to, forgive him forgiving me, and us, and me forgiving myself. Because I think ultimately my dad was just afraid, and he wanted what was best for me. And, ultimately he came to see that, and he lived with my partner, Tony, and I took care of him. My husband cooked and took care of, it was probably the most healing thing. My growing apart from my father because of that was so painful. And so I didn't realize it really until he started, actually in the last year when he was dying. I sort of started looking back on everything, realizing, oh my God, like that really shaped like my whole adult life. And for many years, I divorced him, in a way.
Right.
And not in a mean, we still were polite, and I'd see him, but it was a very painful experience, I'm sure, for him too. And so you were disconnected. Yeah. And so to, have him be able to come back into my life was just a beautiful. And, before he got Alzheimer's a few years ago, He lived with us for about 5 years, but about 2 years before that, a couple of years before that, we went on a cross-country road trip. And I finally really had time to talk to him and tell him about what happened for me. And
was it just the two of you on the trip?
yeah.
Okay.
And he still gets so emotional. He apologized. And I know he meant it. I mean, if we think, it's so hard, and it's interesting. We live in a time where we were talking about this before, it's so hard for us in the current political situation sometimes to have empathy for people on the other side, that where we feel like, well, what you believe or what you think is killing me, right?
Right.
So, and that's very much, I understand and feel that, especially around LGBTQ issues. But it was really interesting to realize that my dad, he always loved me, and he was just afraid, and to actually figure out a way to really allow that in and not, hold him hostage to, things that he had said and done, right. And not hold myself to, there was another part of it. Now I'm really digging down on this, but right. You're getting the you're getting the fresh info. So my sister, when he died, I was, it was like we had a week together just trying to figure out what was going to happen. And, we had lots of time to talk about all the different things from her life, my life, and putting the piece together with, when we think we think that the Alzheimer's had started many years before. But, I found myself saying to her, Ashley, it wasn't Dad's fault that I got HIV. And then I heard myself say, and it's not his fault that I didn't tell him for a couple of years. Right. And it was the first time that I realized it's a very 50-year-old perspective on right. what happened to a 20-year-old. Right. But it's the first time that I realized, oh God, he didn't know. He had no idea. Right. And even though I wasn't keeping the secret from him in order to keep some secret and be secretive like that, I was just trying to protect myself. And I realized that because he didn't have that information, he wasn't able to respond in a way. So when he found out, he responded in a certain way because he was in shock and horror. And right. And I just went, oh my God, it was such a perfect storm. And that's the situation that those of us who were before, I always say I'm the generation that came before the internet, but before right. the internet, we lived in a time where you had to make peace with it wasn't so easy. AIDS was a gift and a godsend and a nightmare. But it was also, the gift was that the gay community finally said we can't. It galvanized us, and we said we're not going to live in the closet. We are not going to live by these old rules that say, we don't. Big part of my journey, once I got sick in 97, I also got sober about literally a few months later. And I started to go to therapy, and, thank God for the cocktail. It was, saving my life, and still here today. Thank you, God, or Great Spirit, or whatever we want to call it. But I feel like the gift of it for me has been to realize that I deserve my quota of oxygen on the planet. And I had been trained to believe that somehow I didn't get to have my quota, or I only got my quota if
there's some left over, you can have some.
Well, or if as long as I kept quiet, as long as I didn't ask for too much. And so the thing I'm most inspired by with the kids today is that they're unapologetic.
Right.
They know they deserve their quota. And I'm good. Good.
So looking back at that portion of your life, what are some of the main things that you have as a takeaway on that, other than what you've just explained?
What portion of my life?
Well, where you are today, but as far as the HIV stuff and the relationships, including your father.
Yeah. Well, what happened is that I feel like all this extra time I've had, I almost died in 97, and then I got sober, and that's now been 25 years since then.
Wow.
So I just celebrated 25 years of sobriety, and
congratulations.
Thank you. And so in February, it'll be 26 years since I almost died of AIDS. Or actually, I think it's January. So it's this month. You know, my takeaway from that is that, yeah, I get to live. I get to take up the oxygen. And I feel like those of us who went through that crucible, have a deep responsibility to share the story. It's not just about saying like, bullet points of, like, I don't know, some World War II timeline that's like, in 1946, blah, blah, blah happened.
Right.
But it's more about sharing the experience. When COVID happened, a lot of us that went through that time were like, oh, yeah, I know about pandemics.
Yeah. Been there, done this.
and we know about like how to navigate. I mean, one thing I'll say is I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I went through the worst hell and fear and terror that anybody could go through in my 20s. And then in my 30s, like recapturing my life. I feel like this whole business of people trying to make you afraid it's like, just don't believe it. Like, I mean, we had to fight the government, the medical industry, the pharmaceutical companies, religion, culture, just basic perceptions, just to believe that we had a right to survive. I'm not going back.
And you shouldn't.
Yeah. And then I got to have my whole career, and then I got to my career back.
Well, you know what? We're going to have you come back and talk about that. But
Okay.
For this one, thank you for coming in today. This has been great.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm glad. Thank you for letting me.